Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today, I want to take you back to one of the most terrifying moments in human history, and I mean that literally. We're going to explore a day when the entire future of democracy, human rights, and basically everything we consider normal about our world hung by the thinnest possible thread. And here's the really wild part. Most people have no idea how close we came to living in a completely different reality. Picture this. It's November 23rd, 1942. The temperature in Stalingrad has plummeted to minus 25 degrees Celsius, a 13 Fahrenheit for those keeping track. The city is a frozen wasteland of rubble and bodies, and scattered across this hellscape are thousands of bunkers where German soldiers are making split-second decisions that will literally determine whether democracy survives the 20th century. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Come on, one battle couldn't have changed everything. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this moment. This wasn't just another battle. This was the exact point where Hitler's war machine came within days, sometimes hours, of achieving total victory over the Soviet Union. And if that had happened, well, let's just say the world you woke up in this morning would be unrecognizable. Let me introduce you to the players in this deadly chess game, because these are the people whose decisions were about to reshape human civilization. On one side, we have General Friedrich Paulus, et al., a meticulous, by-the-book Prussian officer who's commanding the German Sixth Army. We're talking about 300,000 men, an absolutely massive force, and they're trapped in this frozen city like pieces on a board that's slowly closing in around them. On the other side is General Vasily Chuikov, and this guy is defending Stalingrad with barely 100,000 Soviet soldiers. Think about that ratio for a second. He's outnumbered 3-1 by what was arguably the most effective military machine in human history. Every single street corner in this city has become a fortress. Every basement, every bombed-out building, every pile of rubble. It's all turned into a battlefield where the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. Here's what makes this so terrifying. If the Germans break through Soviet lines and capture the city completely, Stalin's government collapses. Just like that. And when I say collapse, I don't mean they negotiate a peace treaty or retreat to fight another day. I mean Nazi Germany suddenly gains control of the world's largest country, 1/6 of the entire planet's landmass. The battle has been raging for 3 months by this point, and both sides are exhausted beyond anything you can imagine. German forces control 90% of the city. 90%. But here's the crazy thing. That final 10% might as well be on the moon. It's like trying to squeeze the last bit of toothpaste out of a tube, except the toothpaste is shooting back at you with machine guns. You want to know how brutal this fighting was? Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev, IF, this guy became a legend. He's picking off German officers from bombed-out apartment buildings, sometimes from distances of over 800 meters in sub-zero temperatures. Meanwhile, German engineers are literally blasting their way through the tractor factory, the Red October steel works, and the Barricadi gun factory inch by bloody inch. They're fighting for individual rooms, sometimes for hours over a single staircase. But here's what keeps me awake at night thinking about this moment in history. The Germans came so incredibly close to winning. We're talking about margins measured in days, sometimes hours, and what that victory would have meant for every person alive today. It's almost too terrifying to fully comprehend. Let me paint you a picture of just how close we're talking about. German forces had pushed Soviet defenders back to the very edge of the Volga River. There were moments when Soviet soldiers literally had their backs to the water with nowhere left to retreat. The German Sixth Army controlled the central railway station, Ride-ATR. They'd captured it and lost it, and recaptured it 17 times. 17 times. Each time, it changed hands at the cost of hundreds of lives. The fighting was so intense that the average life expectancy for a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours. Think about that for a second. 24 hours. These men were being thrown into combat knowing they had roughly a day to live, and yet somehow, impossibly, they kept fighting. Now, Here's where it gets really wild. The German commanders on the ground knew they were running out of time. General Paulus was receiving reports that his ammunition was down to critical levels. His men were eating their horses, then eating leather, then eating whatever they could find. Frostbite was claiming more casualties than enemy fire, but they were so close, tantalizingly close, to breaking through that final Soviet resistance. What makes this moment so historically significant is that everyone involved understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't some regional conflict or territorial dispute. The German High Command knew that capturing Stalingrad would give them control of the Volga River, which was basically the Soviet Union's main artery. Control the Volga, and you control the flow of oil from the Caucasus, the grain from Ukraine, and the industrial production from the Urals. But it went deeper than just resources. Stalin had made it clear that the city bearing his name could not fall. He'd issued Order Number 227. Not one step back. Any Soviet commander who retreated without orders would be shot. Any soldier who showed cowardice would be shot. They'd literally rather die than give up this city. And here's the part that gives me chills every time I think about it. It almost worked for the Germans. On multiple occasions during those final weeks of November 1942, German forces came within a few hundred meters of the Volga riverbank. If they'd reached the river, if they'd cut off Soviet supply lines completely, the city would have fallen within days. The human drama of this moment is just staggering. You have Paulus, this career military officer who's followed orders his entire life, suddenly facing the possibility that his decisions might determine the fate of human civilization. The pressure on this man must have been unimaginable. He's getting conflicting orders from Hitler, who's demanding impossible victories, while his own officers are telling him the situation is hopeless. On the Soviet side, Chuikov is performing what can only be described as a miracle of military leadership. He's moving his headquarters every few days because German artillery keeps finding his position. At one point, his command bunker was just 50 meters from German positions. 50 meters. That's closer than most people park from a grocery store. The weather was becoming a character in this drama all by itself. November 1942 brought some of the worst conditions anyone could remember. Temperatures were dropping so fast that weapons would freeze mid-battle. German equipment, designed for the moderate climates of Western Europe, was failing left and right, but Soviet gear, built for these brutal conditions, kept functioning. And here's something that'll blow your mind. The sound of this battle could be heard from over 40 kilometers away. Imagine standing 40 kilometers from your city and hearing the constant thunder of artillery, machine guns, and explosions. That's how intense this fighting was. The entire city was essentially one giant battlefield where every single building was contested. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the military tactics or the historical significance, AD. It's the human element. These were real people making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. A German sergeant deciding whether to lead his squad into another bombed-out building, knowing most of them won't come back. A Soviet machine gunner choosing to stay at his position when he could retreat, knowing that staying means certain death, but might buy his comrades another few minutes. The civilians caught in this hell deserve their own recognition too. Thousands of Stalingrad residents stayed in the city throughout the battle, hiding in basements and ruins, sometimes helping Soviet forces, sometimes just trying to survive another day. These people were living through what can only be described as the apocalypse, but they stayed because this was their home. But here's what really gets me about this moment in history: the ripple effects of what almost happened. If Stalingrad had fallen, if those German forces had broken through that final Soviet resistance, we're not just talking about a different outcome to World War II. We're talking about a fundamentally different world, where the concepts of human rights, individual liberty, and democratic government might never have developed the way they did. The Nazi plans for conquered Soviet territory weren't theoretical, they were detailed, systematic blueprints for reshaping an entire continent, and those plans were terrifying beyond anything most people can imagine. But we'll get to that part of the story later. For now, I want you to really absorb this moment we're exploring, November 23rd, 1942. -25 degrees Celsius. 300,000 German soldiers on one side, 100,000 Soviet defenders on the other. The future of human civilization hanging in the balance. The decisions made in those frozen bunkers over the next few weeks would determine whether your grandparents lived in freedom or under totalitarian rule, whether the concepts of individual rights and human dignity would survive the 20th century, whether democracy itself would exist in the world you inhabit today. And here's the most sobering part of all. It came down to margins so thin you wouldn't believe them if this were fiction. We're talking about days, sometimes hours, when different choices could have flipped the entire outcome. Individual commanders making split-second decisions that changed the trajectory of human history. So, as we dive deeper into this story, I want you to keep that perspective in mind. This isn't just ancient history we're exploring. This is the moment when everything you consider normal about your world almost went in a completely different direction. The freedom you have to listen to this podcast, the rights you take for granted, the peaceful life you're probably living, all of it traces back to what happened in those frozen ruins 70-some years ago. And trust me, as we explore what almost happened, as we look at how close the Germans actually came to achieving total victory, and what that alternative timeline would have meant for every person on Earth, well, you're going to see your own world in a completely different light. The story we're about to tell isn't just about military history or geopolitical strategy. It's about the knife's edge between the world we know and a nightmare that almost became reality. And understanding that difference, understanding how close we came to living in that alternative timeline, changes everything about how we see the present. So buckle up, because we're about to explore one of the most consequential what-ifs in human history. And by the time we're done, you'll never look at a history book the same way again. Next time, we're going to dive into the terrifying details of how the Germans almost cracked the code to conquering Stalingrad. We'll explore the razor-thin margins that determined victory and defeat, and trust me, the specific moments when everything could have gone differently will absolutely blow your mind. Until then, take care, and thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's most consequential moments. Welcome back. I hope you've been thinking about what we discussed last time, that frozen moment in November 1942, when the entire future of human civilization hung in the balance. Today, we're diving into something that's going to absolutely blow your mind, just how incredibly close the German war machine came to cracking the code to conquering Stalingrad. And when I say close, I'm talking about margins so thin they'll give you goosebumps. We're going to explore the specific moments, the individual decisions, and the tiny factors that could have completely flipped the outcome of the most important battle in human history. So let me take you to December 12th, 1942. Picture this scene. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant military minds, is launching something called Operation Winter Storm. This isn't just another military operation. This is Germany's last desperate attempt to save 300,000 of their best soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, and potentially win the entire war in the process. Manstein has assembled 57,000 fresh troops, tanks, artillery, Mansti, basically everything Germany can spare, for this relief operation. And here's what's absolutely wild about this moment. His forces came within 35 miles of Stalingrad. 35 miles. That's close enough that Paulus's trapped men could actually hear the artillery of their rescuers echoing across the frozen steppe. Think about that for a second. Imagine you're one of those German soldiers, starving and freezing in the ruins of Stalingrad, and suddenly you start hearing friendly artillery fire getting closer and closer. Hope is literally within earshot. The relief force is so close you could probably drive there in half an hour under normal circumstances. But here's where this story gets really dramatic, and where individual decisions literally change the course of human history. Paulus, commanding those 300,000 trapped soldiers, radios Hitler for permission to break out and link up with Manstein's relief force. It's a reasonable military decision, probably the only chance to save his army and possibly win the battle. And here's the moment that gives me chills every time I think about it. Hitler's response took 18 hours. While Manstein's forces are fighting desperately to reach the city, while Soviet reinforcements are rushing to stop the relief operation, while the window of opportunity is slowly closing, Hitler sits in his headquarters and deliberates for 18 hours. Can you imagine the pressure on everyone involved during those 18 hours? Paulus knows his men are dying by the hundreds every day. Manstein knows his relief force is taking heavy casualties and might not be able to hold their positions much longer. Soviet commanders know that if these two German armies link up, they're probably looking at the collapse of their entire front. And when Hitler finally responds, his answer dooms 300,000 German soldiers and potentially saves human civilization. He orders Paulus to hold his positions. No breakout, no retreat. Just hold the city at all costs. Now, here's what's terrifying about this decision. If Hitler had said yes, if he'd authorized that breakout attempt immediately, military historians estimate there was about a 70% chance the German forces would have successfully linked up. 70%. Think about those odds for a second. In an alternate timeline, there's a very good chance you're living in a world where that breakout succeeded. But wait, it gets even more dramatic. The weather became this incredible factor that nobody could control. January 1943 brought what meteorologists called the coldest winter in 50 years. We're talking about temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Celsius, BA. That's minus 40 Fahrenheit too, because it's the same at that temperature. At minus 40, metal becomes brittle, rubber shatters like glass, and human beings can die from exposure in minutes. German equipment, designed for the moderate climates of Western Europe, just started failing across the board. Tank engines wouldn't start, artillery mechanisms froze solid, supply trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Meanwhile, Soviet gear, specifically designed for these brutal conditions, kept functioning. The Red Army had learned to fight in this weather. The Germans were improvising, and it showed. But here's the really wild part. What if that winter had been just 10 degrees warmer? Just 10 degrees. German tanks wouldn't have frozen solid overnight. Supply trucks could have moved freely along the roads. Aircraft could have maintained regular supply drops instead of the pathetic trickle that was getting through. The mathematics of survival change completely with just that small temperature difference. Instead of losing hundreds of men daily to frostbite and exposure, the German forces could have maintained their fighting strength. Instead of equipment failures crippling their ability to fight, their war machine could have operated at something close to full effectiveness. Military analysts have run the numbers on this, and it's sobering. A 10-degree temperature increase would have extended German combat effectiveness by approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks. In the context of this battle, 6 weeks might as well have been 6 years. That's more than enough time for Manstein's relief force to break through Soviet lines and link up with Paulus's army. Now, let me tell you about the personal drama happening behind the scenes, because this is where you really see how impossible choices under unimaginable pressure shaped world history. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, who was leading the Soviet counterattack against Manstein's relief force, later admitted something that'll blow your mind. He thought the Germans would break through on at least 6 separate occasions. 6 times. This isn't some post-war boasting or propaganda. This is a Soviet general, years after the war ended, admitting that he genuinely believed his forces were about to be overrun. Imagine the stress this man was under. He's commanding the forces that are literally the last line of defense between Nazi Germany and total victory over the Soviet Union, and he thinks he's going to lose. Every single day the battle continued was another day closer to either Soviet collapse or German exhaustion, and nobody, and I mean nobody, knew which would come first. The commanders on both sides were making life or death, decisions based on incomplete information, hoping their guesses were right, knowing that being wrong meant catastrophic defeat. Here's another factor that almost changed everything: logistics. The German Sixth Army was supposed to be supplied by air while they held Stalingrad. Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, had promised Hitler that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the trapped army. 500 tons per day, 2 MTA. That's what was needed to keep 300,000 men fighting. Want to know how much they actually delivered? On a good day, maybe 150 tons. On most days, it was closer to 75 tons. That's 15% of what was promised. Imagine trying to feed 300,000 people with 15% of the food they need. It's not just about being hungry. Malnutrition makes you vulnerable to disease, affects your ability to think clearly, and destroys morale faster than enemy bullets. But here's the really crazy part. Those supply shortfalls weren't inevitable. German transport aircraft were available. The problem was fuel, weather, and Soviet air defenses. If just two of those three factors had been different, if Germany had secured better fuel supplies for their transport planes, if the weather had been more cooperative, or if they'd been able to suppress Soviet air defenses more effectively, those supply numbers flip completely. With adequate supplies, the German Sixth Army could have maintained their fighting effectiveness indefinitely. They could have continued their attacks on Soviet positions. They could have broken through to the Volga riverbank and cut off Soviet supply lines completely. The entire battle changes. And speaking of supply lines, let me tell you about something most people don't realize. The Soviets were hanging on by an even thinner thread than the Germans. The only way to get supplies to Soviet forces in Stalingrad was across the Volga River, often under German artillery fire. Soviet soldiers called these supply runs the Road of Death, because so many boats and rafts were destroyed trying to make the crossing. There were nights when Soviet defenders in the city received no supplies at all. Zero. They were fighting with whatever ammunition they had left, eating whatever food they could scavenge, using captured German weapons when their own ran out of bullets. If the Germans had been able to completely cut off those river crossings for just a few days, Soviet resistance might have collapsed entirely. The individual acts of heroism during this period are just staggering. Soviet soldiers volunteering for what were essentially suicide missions to deliver ammunition to forward positions. German medics crawling through rubble under sniper fire to reach wounded comrades. Engineers from both sides working in sub-zero temperatures to repair equipment, knowing that a single mechanical failure could determine the outcome of the entire battle. But what really gets me about this period is how many times the outcome could have been different based on seemingly minor decisions. If Paulus had been more aggressive in his final push toward the Volga riverbank, if Soviet commanders had committed their reserve forces a day earlier or a day later, if German intelligence had been better at predicting where Soviet reinforcements would arrive, each of these decisions was made by real people under impossible pressure, with incomplete information, knowing that being wrong might mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. And the margins were so thin that historians still debate whether different choices would have changed the outcome. Here's something that'll give you chills. Intercepted German communications from this period show that Paulus himself estimated only a 30% chance of success, even before the relief operation failed. 30%. This guy is commanding 300,000 soldiers in what might be the most important battle in human history, and he privately thinks he's probably going to lose. Meanwhile, Hitler's staff was privately calculating that they needed Stalingrad captured by December 15th to avoid what they called catastrophic collapse. December 15th, that's just 3 days after Manstein launched his relief operation. They knew the window was closing, they knew time was running out, but they couldn't make the pieces fit together fast enough. The tragedy, or maybe we should call it the miracle, of this moment is that both sides were closer to total collapse than their enemies realized. German forces were literally eating their horses, then eating leather, then eating whatever they could find. Soviet forces were down to their last reserves of ammunition and manpower. Whoever broke first would lose everything. And in the end, it came down to endurance. Pure, brutal endurance. Who could keep fighting longer under impossible conditions? Who could maintain their will to fight when everything seemed hopeless? The answer to those questions determined not just the outcome of the Battle of Stalingrad, but the entire future trajectory of human civilization. The really sobering thing about studying this period is how many near misses there were. How many moments when different timing, better luck, or slightly different circumstances could have handed victory to Nazi Germany. It's not that the good guys won because they were destined to win. They won because they held on just a little bit longer than the other side. Next time, we're going to explore what would have happened if those razor-thin margins had gone the other way. We're going to dive into that alternative timeline where German victory at Stalingrad triggers a cascade of events that reshapes the entire world. And trust me, when you see how quickly everything would have unraveled, how fast the dominoes would have fallen across the globe, it's going to change how you think about the world you're living in today. Until then, take a moment to appreciate just how close we came to living in a completely different reality. Those 18 hours when Hitler delayed his response, those 10 degrees of temperature that crippled German equipment, those supply shortfalls that weakened both armies, any one of those factors could have gone differently. And you'd be waking up in a world that's almost unrecognizable from the one you know today. Hey there, welcome back. I hope you've been thinking about those razor-thin margins we discussed last time, how close Nazi Germany came to achieving total victory at Stalingrad. Today, we're stepping into truly chilling territory. We're going to explore what would have happened if those margins had gone the other way. If Hitler had authorized that breakout attempt immediately, if the weather had been 10 degrees warmer, if any one of those critical factors had shifted just slightly in Germany's favor. What I'm about to describe isn't science fiction or wild speculation. This is based on actual Nazi plans, documented strategies, and the inevitable chain of events that would have followed German victory at Stalingrad. And I've got to warn you, this alternative timeline is genuinely terrifying. So, let's step into that alternate reality. It's February 10th, 1943, and the unthinkable has just happened. German forces have successfully captured Stalingrad. Paulus's Sixth Army has linked up with Manstein's relief force, Soviet resistance in the city has collapsed, and Nazi Germany now controls the crucial gateway to the Caucasus oil fields. Now watch how fast the dominoes begin falling across the entire globe. And when I say fast, I mean within 72 hours of Stalingrad's fall, Stalin's government is evacuating Moscow. Think about that timeline for a second. 72 hours. That's how quickly one military victory cascades into the potential collapse of the world's largest country. Here's why it happens so fast. Stalingrad wasn't just symbolic, it was the key to everything. With the city in German hands, Nazi forces can now push down the Volga River toward the Caspian Sea. The Trans-Siberian Railway, that massive artery connecting European Russia to the Pacific Ocean, suddenly becomes Germany's highway to the east. Those oil fields in the Caucasus that the Soviet Union desperately needed to fuel their war machine, they fall within weeks. But the psychological impact is even more devastating than the strategic gains. Stalin had made the defense of his namesake city a matter of personal and national honor. Not one step back was the order. Soviet propaganda had convinced millions of people that Stalingrad could never fall. When it does fall, when that impossible defeat becomes reality, the shock waves shatter Soviet morale from Moscow to Vladivostok. Now, let me take you to London, where Winston Churchill is about to receive the most devastating news of his political career. It's 3 in the morning on February 14th, 1943, Valentine's Day, if you can believe the irony. Churchill is awakened by an aide with a telegram from Moscow. Stalin's government is evacuating the capital. The Red Army is in full retreat. The Eastern Front has collapsed. Churchill sits in his study at Downing Street, still in his pajamas and bathrobe, reading this telegram over and over again. Because he understands immediately what this means for Britain. With the Soviet Union out of the war, Nazi Germany can transfer massive numbers of troops and resources from the Eastern Front to the West. Those Atlantic Wall fortifications that are protecting occupied Europe, they're about to become impregnable. But it gets worse for Britain. Much worse. German forces advancing through the Soviet Arctic now have access to ports along the northern coast. Imagine German submarines launching from Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, cutting off British supply lines through the Arctic Ocean. The entire Royal Navy is tied up in the Atlantic trying to protect convoys, and suddenly there are new submarine bases 1,000 miles closer to British shipping lanes. The invasion of Britain, postponed since 1940 when Germany couldn't achieve air superiority, suddenly becomes feasible again. With Soviet airfields in German hands, Luftwaffe bombers can attack Britain from multiple directions. German naval forces can operate from Soviet ports along the Baltic and Arctic coasts. The strategic situation for Britain has become absolutely hopeless. Now let's fly across the Atlantic to Washington, where Franklin Roosevelt is about to face the greatest crisis of his presidency. His advisors wake him at 2 in the morning with news from London. Churchill is requesting an emergency conversation. The war in Europe might already be lost. Roosevelt calls an emergency cabinet meeting that lasts 14 hours. 14 hours. Picture the most powerful leaders in America sitting around a table, trying to figure out how to fight a war against enemies who now control most of Europe and Asia. Because that's the reality they're suddenly facing. The math is absolutely terrifying. Nazi Germany plus Japan now control territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the Pacific islands of Micronesia. We're talking about roughly 60% of the world's landmass under Axis control. The industrial capacity, the natural resources, the manpower, IPA, America and Britain combined can't match what their enemies now possess. But here's where it gets really chilling. The human cost starts unfolding with terrifying speed. 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, already starving in German camps, face immediate execution as the Wehrmacht prepares for rapid advance eastward. The Germans don't want to deal with feeding and guarding millions of prisoners when they're trying to push their armies across thousands of miles of conquered territory. Entire cities begin emptying as populations flee ahead of advancing German armies. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, millions of people grabbing whatever they can carry and running east toward the Urals. The refugee crisis is unlike anything the world has ever seen. We're talking about population movements that make every subsequent refugee crisis look small by comparison. The Trans-Caucasus oil fields fall within 6 weeks of Stalingrad's capture. This isn't just an economic blow to the Soviet Union. It's a strategic catastrophe for Britain. Those oil supplies were flowing through Iran to support British operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean. With that supply line cut, British forces in Egypt and Palestine become critically short of fuel. Rommel's Africa Corps, reinforced with troops transferred from the now quiet Eastern Front, launches a new offensive across North Africa. Without adequate fuel supplies, British forces can't maintain mobile operations in the desert. The Suez Canal falls to German control, cutting off British access to India and the Far East through the Mediterranean. But the most chilling development happens in Tokyo, where Emperor Hirohito's War Council makes a decision that changes everything about the Pacific War. With the Soviet Union collapsing, Japan can finally do what they've wanted to do since 1937, attack north through Siberia, while simultaneously maintaining pressure on American forces in the Pacific. Think about what this means for America. December 7th, 1941, Yumei, Pearl Harbor, Yumei, was just the beginning. Now the United States faces a genuine two-ocean war against enemies who control the world's largest landmass. Japanese forces can attack American positions in Alaska from Soviet territory. German submarines can operate from bases stretching from Norway to the Arctic Ocean. The strategic situation becomes impossible. America simply doesn't have enough ships, planes, and troops to defend both the Atlantic and Pacific approaches, while also supporting whatever's left of British resistance in Europe. For the first time since the War of 1812, the American mainland faces genuine threat of invasion. Here's something that'll give you chills. Within 90 days of Stalingrad's fall, German and Japanese forces are coordinating operations across the Eurasian landmass. Japanese troops advancing through Siberia link up with German forces pushing east from the Urals. The Trans-Siberian Railway becomes a joint German-Japanese supply line stretching from Berlin to Tokyo. The psychological impact on the remaining Allied forces is devastating. Soldiers and civilians who had believed in inevitable Allied victory suddenly face the reality that the war might already be lost. Resistance movements across occupied Europe, sustained by hope that the Red Army would eventually liberate them, collapse as news spreads that the Soviet Union no longer exists as a fighting force. In occupied France, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece, partisan fighters begin surrendering to German forces. Why continue fighting when there's no prospect of liberation? Why risk torture and execution for a cause that seems hopeless? The underground networks that had been sabotaging German operations across Europe start falling apart, but perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this alternative timeline is how quickly it becomes irreversible. Every week that passes makes German victory more complete, more permanent. Soviet industrial facilities beyond the Urals are captured before they can be evacuated. The scientists and engineers working on advanced weapons projects fall into German hands along with their research. Imagine German scientists gaining access to Soviet nuclear research. Stalin had ordered his nuclear program accelerated in 1942, hoping to develop atomic weapons before Germany. In our timeline, that research eventually contributed to the Pord Soviet bomb in 1949. In this alternative timeline, German physicists get access to Soviet nuclear research years earlier. The balance of power shifts so dramatically that negotiated peace becomes impossible. Britain and America aren't facing an enemy they can defeat through superior production or resources. They're facing an enemy that controls more territory, more people, and more natural resources than they do. Traditional strategies for winning prolonged wars simply don't apply anymore. Churchill, faced with this impossible situation, begins considering the unthinkable: negotiated surrender, not because he wants to give up, but because continuing the fight might mean the complete destruction of British civilization. Roosevelt faces similar pressures from Congress and military leaders, who argue that America should focus on defending the Western Hemisphere, rather than fighting an unwinnable war across two oceans. And here's the most sobering part of this alternative timeline. It all traces back to those 18 hours when Hitler delayed his response to Paulus's request for a breakout attempt. The margin between the world we know and this nightmare alternative was literally measured in hours. Everything you consider normal about international relations, human rights, democratic government, individual liberty, APAA, all of it depends on the fact that German forces failed to capture Stalingrad in early 1943. The world order we live in today, the freedoms you take for granted, the peace you probably enjoy, it all stems from that failure. Next time, we're going to dive into the truly horrific details of what German-controlled Soviet territory would have looked like. The Nazi plans for conquered Slavic lands weren't theoretical. They were detailed blueprints for systematic genocide on a scale that would have dwarfed even the Holocaust. And those plans were ready to implement the moment military victory was achieved. I've got to warn you, the next part of our story is genuinely disturbing. But it's important to understand what was at stake, what the world barely avoided, and why the margins that determined victory and defeat at Stalingrad mattered so much for every human being alive today. Until then, take a moment to appreciate just how fortunate our actual timeline is. The world you woke up in this morning exists because exhausted Soviet soldiers held frozen positions in Stalingrad for just a few weeks longer than seemed humanly possible. Welcome back. I need to start today with a warning. What we're about to discuss is genuinely disturbing. We're going to explore the Nazi plans for conquered Soviet territory, TAMI, plans that were already drawn up in meticulous detail, ready to implement the moment military victory was achieved. This isn't speculation or theoretical horror. These were actual blueprints for systematic genocide on a scale that would have dwarfed even the Holocaust. If you're listening with children around, you might want to wait for a better time. What I'm about to describe represents humanity at its absolute worst, and understanding it is crucial for appreciating how close we came to living in a fundamentally different world. The Nazi plans for conquered Soviet territory read like something out of humanity's darkest nightmare. But they were real. Heinrich Himmler's office had prepared documents called the General Plan East, General Plan Ost in German, IKORE, and these documents outlined the systematic elimination of 100 million Slavic people across the captured territories. 100 million people. Let that number sink in for a moment. The entire population of the Philippines is about 110 million people. The population of Vietnam is 97 million. We're talking about the planned elimination of entire nations' worth of human beings. And here's what makes this so terrifying. This wasn't some theoretical document gathering dust in a filing cabinet. This was scheduled to begin within 6 months of military victory. The infrastructure was ready, the personnel were trained, and the logistics were already being organized. Picture assembly line genocide operating across 11 time zones. That's the reality we're talking about. From the forests of Poland to the steppes of Kazakhstan, from the Arctic tundra to the shores of the Black Sea, the Nazis had planned systematic killing operations that would make the Holocaust look small by comparison. The infrastructure was already partially in place. Special SS units called Einsatzgruppen had been operating in occupied Soviet territories since the invasion began in June 1941. These mobile killing units had already murdered over 1 million people during just the first year of the war. They'd developed efficient methods for mass execution, body disposal, and record-keeping, but with German control extending to the Pacific Ocean, these operations would expand to an industrial scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. Instead of mobile killing units operating behind advancing armies, we're talking about permanent facilities designed to process millions of people across thousands of miles of territory. The plan called for reducing the Slavic population from approximately 100 million people to 15 million. 15 million. That's barely enough to serve as slave labor for German settlers. The arithmetic of this genocide is just staggering. 85 million people marked for elimination in the largest act of systematic murder in human history. Entire cities were marked for complete elimination. Leningrad, with 3 million inhabitants, was scheduled to be emptied and destroyed. Moscow's population would be eliminated, and the city itself would be flooded by damming the Moscow River. Kiev, Minsk, Riga, Vilnius, AF, every major population center in conquered Soviet territory was marked for destruction. The surviving 15 million people would be relocated to designated zones beyond the Urals, where they would slowly starve under conditions designed to ensure their gradual extinction. These weren't concentration camps in the traditional sense. They were death zones, where people would be left to die of hunger, disease, and exposure over periods of months or years. But the horror extends far beyond murder to complete cultural annihilation. Every library, museum, and university in conquered Soviet territory was scheduled for destruction. The goal wasn't just to kill people. It was to erase every trace that Slavic civilization had ever existed. The Russian language would be banned completely. Children caught speaking Russian would be separated from their families. Orthodox Christianity would be eliminated, churches destroyed, priests executed, religious texts burned. All traces of Slavic culture, from folk songs to traditional crafts, were to be systematically erased. German settlers, promised free land and slave labor, were already being recruited from across occupied Europe. The SS had prepared detailed plans for agricultural colonies, industrial facilities, and administrative centers that would replace the eliminated Slavic cities. These weren't vague ideas. They were specific architectural plans with construction schedules and resource requirements. The logistics were terrifyingly well organized. Special trains had been constructed for mass deportations, with sealed cars designed to transport people efficiently over long distances. Detention camps were under construction across Poland and Belarus, with specific capacities and operational procedures already determined. Nazi bureaucrats had calculated exactly how many cattle cars would be needed for transporting entire populations. They'd determined optimal loading procedures to maximize efficiency while minimizing transportation costs. They'd even calculated caloric requirements for prisoners during transport, TARP, not to keep them healthy, but to prevent deaths that would complicate body disposal. The same methodical efficiency that made the Holocaust possible was being scaled up to cover 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. But where the Holocaust targeted specific populations within German-controlled territory, the General Plan East targeted entire nations for complete elimination. Here's something that'll give you chills. The Nazis had already begun implementing portions of this plan in occupied Poland and other areas. The techniques for mass murder, the administrative procedures for population transfers, the methods for cultural destruction, i.s. They'd been testing and refining these approaches since 1939. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 had coordinated the final solution for European Jews, but the General Plan East was far more ambitious. Where the final solution targeted 11 million people across occupied Europe, the General Plan East targeted 100 million people across the conquered Soviet territories. The personnel were already trained and organized. SS administrators who had managed ghettos in Poland were prepared to oversee much larger operations across Soviet territory. Guards who had operated concentration camps were ready to supervise the new death zones. Bureaucrats who had organized deportations from Western Europe were prepared to handle population transfers on a continental scale. Medical professionals had developed efficient methods for mass killing using poison gas. Engineers had designed cremation facilities capable of disposing of thousands of bodies daily. Transportation specialists had calculated optimal schedules for moving people and supplies across thousands of miles. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this plan was how it would have been presented to the German people and the world. Nazi propaganda had already begun describing Slavic people as subhuman, Untermenschen in German. The elimination of these populations would have been portrayed as necessary for European civilization, as clearing the land for superior German settlers. International opinion, already largely powerless to stop the Holocaust, would have been even less capable of intervening in operations across Soviet territory. With Britain facing invasion and America fighting a two-ocean war, there would have been no practical way to stop the implementation of the General Plan East. The economic aspects of this genocide were equally well planned. Slavic slave laborers would be worked to death in German industrial facilities. Their life expectancy would be calculated to maximize economic output while minimizing food and housing costs. When they died from overwork, malnutrition, and disease, they would be replaced by new slave laborers from the death zones. Natural resources across Soviet territory would be extracted using slave labor and transported to Germany. The coal mines of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the timber forests of Siberia, 217, all would become sources of wealth for the expanded German Reich, worked by people who were slowly being worked to death. Children would receive special attention in this system of organized horror. Slavic children deemed racially valuable would be kidnapped and sent to Germany for Germanization, forced adoption by German families after their identities were completely erased. The remaining children would be denied education, health care, and adequate nutrition until they died. The plan included detailed provisions for preventing any organized resistance. Potential leaders, teachers, priests, government officials, military officers, TTB, would be identified and eliminated immediately. Communities would be broken up and relocated to prevent the formation of resistance networks. Traditional social structures would be systematically destroyed. Even the landscape itself would be transformed. Slavic place names would be replaced with German names. Historic monuments would be destroyed and replaced with German colonial architecture. The goal was to create a completely German landscape where no trace of previous inhabitants remained. Here's what makes this even more terrifying. The Nazis had calculated that implementing the General Plan East would take approximately 25 years. 25 years. They weren't planning a quick extermination campaign. They were planning a generation-long process of systematic cultural and physical genocide that would completely transform the largest landmass on Earth. The survivors of this process, ISA, those 15 million Slavic people who would be kept alive as slave laborers, would be deliberately prevented from reproducing. Forced sterilization, separation of families, and calculated malnutrition would ensure that even this remnant population would gradually die out over subsequent generations. And here's the most sobering part. All of this was ready to begin immediately, following German military victory. The moment Stalingrad fell, the moment Soviet resistance collapsed, the implementation of the General Plan East would have commenced. Within weeks of military victory, the trains would have started rolling toward the death zones. The machinery of this genocide was so well organized, so thoroughly planned, and so ready for implementation that stopping it would have been virtually impossible once it began. With German control extending across 11 time zones, with no effective international opposition, with willing personnel already trained and equipped, the systematic elimination of 100 million people would have proceeded with industrial efficiency. Understanding this plan, understanding how close it came to implementation, fundamentally changes how we view the Battle of Stalingrad. This wasn't just a military contest between two armies. This was literally a battle for the survival of entire civilizations, entire ways of life, entire concepts of human dignity and worth. Every Soviet soldier who died defending Stalingrad, every civilian who endured the siege, every commander who made the desperate decision to hold their positions against impossible odds, they were standing between 100 million innocent people and systematic extermination. Next time, we're going to explore something equally fascinating, but far less disturbing. How modern historians and researchers study events that never happened. How do you investigate an alternative timeline? How do you research something that didn't occur? The methods and discoveries of counterfactual history are absolutely mind-blowing. Until then, I want you to sit with the weight of what we've discussed today. The world you live in, the freedoms you enjoy, the basic assumption that human life has value and dignity, all of it exists because the implementation of the General Plan East was prevented by exhausted soldiers holding frozen positions in a ruined city. The margin between our reality and this nightmare alternative was measured in days, sometimes hours. Remember that. Remember how close we came to living in a world where the systematic elimination of 100 million people was not only possible, but actually happening. Hey there! Welcome back! After diving into some pretty dark territory last time, today we're going to explore something absolutely fascinating that'll blow your mind in a completely different way. We're going to look at how historians and researchers study something that never actually happened. How do you investigate an alternative timeline? How do you research events that didn't occur? How do you prove what would have happened if history had gone differently? It's like being archaeological detectives, but instead of digging up artifacts from the past, they're excavating alternate futures from mountains of evidence. And the methods they've developed, the discoveries they've made, and the precision they've achieved is just incredible. The story begins in 1964 with a British historian named Geoffrey Hawthorne, who basically revolutionized how we think about historical causation. Hawthorne made this radical argument that studying what didn't happen could actually teach us more about why things did happen than studying the events themselves. Think about that for a second. Traditional history focuses on what actually occurred, the dates, the battles, the decisions that were made. But Hawthorne argued that understanding why certain alternatives didn't happen gives us much deeper insight into the forces that shape historical events. It's like being a detective investigating a crime that didn't occur. Instead of asking, who committed this murder, you're asking, why didn't this murder happen when all the conditions seemed perfect for it? The investigation requires completely different methods, but the insights you gain are potentially much more valuable. The breakthrough that really changed everything came with computer modeling in the 1980s. Military historians realized they could feed actual data, i.e. German and Soviet troop strengths, supply levels, weather conditions, equipment capabilities, into sophisticated computer programs and test alternative scenarios. And here's where it gets really wild. When they ran these simulations using actual historical data from the Battle of Stalingrad, the results were absolutely startling. German victory wasn't just possible, it was far more likely than anyone had realized. Small changes in timing, logistics, or weather patterns flipped the outcome in 63% of simulated battles. 63%! Think about that for a moment. In nearly two-thirds of computer simulations using real historical data, the Germans won the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviet victory that actually happened was, statistically speaking, the unlikely outcome. This is where counterfactual history gets really scientific. These aren't historians sitting around speculating about what might have happened. These are researchers using the same mathematical and computational methods that meteorologists use to predict weather or engineers use to design aircraft. Harvard historian Niall Ferguson revolutionized the field even further in 1997 by establishing rigorous rules for counterfactual analysis. No wild speculation allowed. Every alternative scenario has to be supported by documentary evidence showing it was actually considered by historical actors at the time. This means diving deep into archives that most people never see. German military records captured after the war. Soviet intelligence reports that were classified for decades. Personal diaries of commanders writing about options they considered but never implemented. Intercepted communications revealing what leaders actually knew versus what they claimed to know. Ferguson's rules are incredibly strict. You can't just say, "What if Hitler had been more patient?" You have to find evidence that Hitler's staff actually recommended patience and that he seriously considered that option. You can't speculate about alternative technologies unless you can prove the technology was actually being developed at the time. The most fascinating discoveries have come from decoded German communications that were kept secret for decades after the war. Operation Ultra, AS, the British code-breaking program, EPI, intercepted thousands of German military messages during the Battle of Stalingrad. And when historians finally got access to these decrypted communications in the 1970s and 80s, they revealed something shocking. German commanders were far more pessimistic about their chances at Stalingrad than their post-war memoirs suggested. General Paulus himself, in encrypted communications with his superiors, estimated only a 30% chance of success even before the relief operation failed. Hitler's staff, in internal messages they thought would never be decoded, privately calculated that they needed the city captured by December 15th to avoid what they called catastrophic collapse. These weren't public statements or propaganda. These were private, encrypted communications between military commanders discussing their actual assessment of the situation, and they show that the people making decisions understood how precarious their position really was. Modern historians use techniques borrowed from chaos theory and game theory to understand how tiny changes cascade into massive consequences. They've identified 17 specific decision points during the Battle of Stalingrad, where different choices would have changed the outcome. 17. Each decision was made by a real person under enormous pressure, and each could have flipped the entire course of world history. They've also identified 6 critical weather events that determined whether German equipment functioned properly. The temperature on specific days, the timing of snowstorms, the formation of ice on the Volga River, all of these natural factors that nobody could control but that had enormous impact on military operations. The precision these researchers have achieved is almost surgical. They can tell you exactly which day different supply deliveries would have shifted the balance of forces. They can calculate how many additional tanks the Germans would have needed to break through Soviet lines at specific locations. They can even estimate how different personality types among key commanders might have led to different strategic decisions. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Researchers have used artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze thousands of historical documents and identify patterns that human historians might miss. AI systems can process vast amounts of data about troop movements, supply levels, weather conditions, and communication patterns to identify critical variables that determined outcomes. One study used machine learning to analyze over 50,000 German and Soviet military reports from the Stalingrad period. The AI identified 37 factors that correlated with German success or failure in specific battles. Some of these factors were obvious: ammunition levels, troop strength, weather conditions, but others were completely unexpected. For example, the AI found that German performance correlated strongly with the morale indicators in Soviet communications intercepted 3 days earlier. This suggests that German intelligence was better at reading Soviet morale than historians had previously realized, and that Soviet morale fluctuations had measurable impact on German tactical decisions. Another unexpected finding: the timing of mail deliveries to German troops had significant impact on combat effectiveness. Units that received mail from home within the previous week performed measurably better than units that hadn't received mail for longer periods. This sounds trivial, but when you're talking about margins as thin as those at Stalingrad, even small morale factors could tip the balance. The methodology has become so sophisticated that counterfactual historians now work closely with political scientists, economists, and even psychologists to understand how alternative outcomes might have developed. They're not just asking, what if Germany had won at Stalingrad? They're asking, what would German victory have meant for economic development in conquered territories? How would it have affected social structures? What would the psychological impact have been on populations across Europe and Asia? These interdisciplinary approaches have revealed connections that pure military history might miss. For example, economists studying Nazi economic plans for conquered Soviet territory have shown that German victory would have created unsustainable resource demands. Even if Germany had conquered the Soviet Union, maintaining control would have required more troops and resources than Germany could reasonably deploy. This kind of analysis helps historians evaluate the long-term viability of alternative scenarios. It's not enough to show that German victory at Stalingrad was possible. Port Tensei. You also need to understand whether that victory could have been sustained over time. Psychologists studying Nazi racial ideology have contributed equally important insights. They've analyzed how systematic genocide on the scale planned for Soviet territory would have affected both perpetrators and survivors. The psychological trauma of implementing the General Plan East would have created social and political instabilities that might have undermined German control even if military conquest had been successful. The international academic collaboration on these projects is just incredible. Russian historians providing access to Soviet archives, German historians sharing Wehrmacht records, British historians contributing ultra-intercepts, American historians offering logistical analysis, Polish historians documenting occupation policies. The collective effort to understand this alternative timeline involves scholars from dozens of countries working together. And here's something really fascinating. This research isn't just academic. Military academies around the world study these counterfactual analyses to understand how small factors can determine large outcomes. The U.S. Army War College runs regular seminars on the Battle of Stalingrad, specifically to teach officers about decision-making under uncertainty and the importance of contingency planning. NATO strategic planners use counterfactual analysis to evaluate current threats and develop response strategies. If small changes in weather, logistics, or timing could have handed Nazi Germany control of the Soviet Union in 1943, what small factors might determine the outcome of modern conflicts? The precision of this research has reached the point where historians can create hour-by-hour timelines of alternative scenarios. They can tell you exactly when specific German units would have reached the Volga riverbank if Manstein's relief operation had succeeded. They can map the probable routes of Soviet retreat if Stalin's government had evacuated Moscow. They can even estimate casualty figures for battles that never happened. But perhaps the most important contribution of counterfactual history is how it changes our understanding of historical causation. Traditional history often makes past events seem inevitable. 24. As if democracy was destined to triumph over fascism, as if the good guys were bound to win eventually. Counterfactual analysis shows us how contingent historical outcomes really are. Democracy didn't triumph because it was inherently superior or because historical forces favored freedom over tyranny. Democracy survived because specific people made specific decisions under specific circumstances, and those decisions could easily have gone differently. Understanding this contingency changes how we think about the present. If the world order we live in today resulted from a series of near-miss decisions and chance events, then that world order isn't inevitable or permanent. It requires constant effort to maintain and defend. Next time, we're going to explore how this understanding of historical contingency shapes contemporary politics, military strategy, and international relations. The lessons learned from studying what almost happened at Stalingrad are influencing real decisions being made in war rooms and government offices around the world right now. The ghost of this alternative timeline still haunts us, and understanding why will change how you think about current events, international relations, and the fragility of the freedoms we sometimes take for granted. Until then, think about the incredible detective work that goes into studying events that never happened. These historians and researchers are literally excavating alternative futures from mountains of evidence, using cutting-edge technology and rigorous methodology to understand how close we came to living in a completely different world. Welcome back. Last time we explored the incredible detective work that goes into studying alternative timelines. Today, we're going to discover something that might surprise you. This alternative history isn't just academic speculation sitting in dusty libraries. The lessons learned from studying what almost happened at Stalingrad are actively shaping real decisions being made in war rooms, government offices, and international organizations around the world right now. This ghost of an alternative timeline still haunts us, and understanding why will fundamentally change how you think about current events, international relations, and the fragility of the freedoms you probably take for granted. Let me take you inside the Pentagon, where military planners study the Stalingrad scenarios not as historical curiosities, but as active case studies for understanding how quickly modern conflicts can reach catastrophic tipping points. The lesson they've learned is absolutely chilling. Even superpowers can collapse faster than anyone expects when key strategic points fall to enemy control. The analysis goes like this. If the Soviet Union, with its massive territory, enormous population, and substantial military forces, could have been completely eliminated as a fighting force within 6 months of losing one city, then no modern nation is immune to rapid strategic collapse. The implications for contemporary military planning are staggering. NATO's Rapid Response Doctrine, developed in the 1990s and constantly updated since then, draws directly from Stalingrad analysis. Military strategists realized something crucial. If Soviet forces had collapsed in 1943, no amount of American industrial production could have prevented German victory. The Atlantic Ocean wouldn't have protected America from enemies controlling most of Europe and Asia. The answer they developed was positioning troops and equipment forward, close enough to respond before cascading failures begin. Every NATO base in Eastern Europe exists. In Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, exists because of lessons learned from studying this alternative timeline. The principle is simple but profound. Prevent small defeats from becoming catastrophic collapses. Think about that for a second. Military bases that exist today, where real soldiers are stationed right now, were positioned based on analysis of what would have happened if German forces had captured Stalingrad 80 years ago. The alternative timeline we've been exploring isn't just history. It's actively influencing contemporary geopolitical strategy. But the influence goes far deeper than military planning. The psychological impact of understanding how close democracy came to extinction in 1943 has fundamentally changed how we view human rights and international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted in 1948, explicitly references the need to prevent the kind of systematic elimination that would have followed German victory at Stalingrad. Eleanor Roosevelt, who chaired the commission that wrote the declaration, had access to intelligence reports about Nazi plans for conquered Soviet territory. The language about protecting human dignity wasn't abstract philosophy. It was a direct response to documented plans for continental-scale genocide. Article 3 of the Declaration states that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. That language was written by people who had seen detailed Nazi blueprints for eliminating 100 million people. Article 18, protecting freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, was a direct response to plans for erasing entire cultures and belief systems. The entire framework of modern international law governing genocide prevention traces its origins to analyzing what would have happened if Nazi Germany had gained control of Soviet territory. The Genocide Convention of 1948, the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court, the responsibility to protect doctrine adopted by the United Nations in 2005, all of these legal frameworks exist because historians and policymakers documented exactly what expanded Nazi control would have looked like Modern genocide prevention strategies are built around lessons learned from studying the General Plan East. The early warning systems that monitor ethnic tensions around the world, the rapid response mechanisms for international intervention, the legal frameworks that allow military action to prevent systematic extermination, SME, all of this exists because researchers proved that Nazi plans for Soviet territory were not only real but completely ready for implementation. Here's something that'll give you chills. The responsibility to protect doctrine, which allows international intervention to prevent genocide, was specifically designed to address scenarios like the one that almost unfolded in Soviet territory. The doctrine recognizes that sovereignty cannot shield governments from intervention when systematic extermination is planned or underway. The legal precedent was established because historians demonstrated that the General Plan East wasn't theoretical, it was a practical blueprint with specific timelines, resource allocations, and operational procedures. If similar plans were discovered today, the international community now has legal authority to intervene before implementation begins. But perhaps the most significant impact of studying this alternative timeline is how it shapes our understanding of the fragility of civilization itself. Democracy didn't triumph over fascism because it was inherently superior or because historical forces favored freedom. Democracy survived because exhausted Soviet soldiers held frozen positions in Stalingrad for just a few weeks longer than seemed humanly possible. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about contemporary threats to democratic institutions. When we see authoritarian movements gaining strength, when we witness attacks on press freedom or judicial independence, when we observe the gradual erosion of voting rights, we're watching echoes of the same forces that almost triumphed in 1943. The difference is that we now understand how quickly things can change. Democratic institutions that seem permanent and stable can collapse with shocking speed when key pressure points are compromised. The lesson from Stalingrad isn't that democracy always wins. It's that democracy survives only through constant vigilance and active defense. Intelligence agencies around the world use counterfactual analysis to evaluate current threats and develop response strategies. The CIA, MI6, the BND, the DGSE, all of these organizations employ historians and analysts who specialize in alternative timeline research. They're not just studying what might happen in the future. They're studying what almost happened in the past to understand how seemingly stable situations can deteriorate rapidly. The methodology has become so sophisticated that intelligence analysts can identify early warning indicators for regime collapse, social breakdown, or strategic realignment by studying historical near misses. If small changes in logistics, weather, or timing could have handed Nazi Germany control of the Soviet Union, what small factors might determine the stability of current governments or alliances? This analysis has real-world applications. The Arab Spring, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rapid rise of China as a global power, IV, all of these developments were partially anticipated by analysts using counterfactual methods to understand how small changes can produce massive systemic shifts. European Union policy is explicitly shaped by understanding how quickly the continent could fall under totalitarian control. The EU's emphasis on economic integration, political cooperation, and shared democratic values isn't just idealistic vision. It's practical recognition that European civilization barely survived the 20th century and requires active effort to maintain. The expansion of the European Union to include former Soviet satellite states, the development of common defense policies, the emphasis on human rights monitoring, TAM. All of these policies reflect understanding that the alternative to European cooperation could be catastrophic conflict and potential totalitarian resurgence. Here's something most people don't realize. The establishment of Israel happened partly because world leaders saw what systematic genocide looked like when scaled to continental proportions. The Nazi plans for Soviet territory demonstrated that the Holocaust wasn't an aberration or an extreme case. It was a pilot program for much larger operations. Understanding the scope of what was planned for conquered Soviet territory made it clear that Jewish communities needed a sovereign state capable of defending itself. The international support for Israeli independence in 1948 was influenced by recognition that minority populations couldn't rely on other nations for protection against systematic extermination. The Cold War itself, for all its dangers, represented a world where democracy had survived its greatest test and learned to defend itself. The nuclear standoff between the United States and Soviet Union was terrifying, but it was also proof that totalitarian expansion could be contained and that democratic societies could maintain the military strength necessary to deter aggression. NATO, the Marshall Plan, the development of nuclear deterrence, MA, all of these Cold War institutions were designed around the lesson that democratic societies must maintain overwhelming defensive capabilities to prevent the kind of rapid collapse that almost occurred in 1943. Contemporary China policy is also influenced by Stalingrad analysis. Strategic planners understand that rapid shifts in the balance of power can have catastrophic consequences. Whether China becomes a responsible stakeholder in the international system or a revisionist power seeking to overturn existing arrangements could determine whether the 21st century resembles the peaceful competition of the later Cold War or the catastrophic conflicts of the 1940s. The economic implications are equally profound. The Bretton Woods system, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, SA. All of these institutions were designed to prevent the kind of economic warfare and autarky that characterized the 1930s and contributed to global conflict. Free trade isn't just about economic efficiency. It's about creating interdependence that makes catastrophic conflict less likely. When nations depend on each other for essential goods and services, they have powerful incentives to resolve disputes peacefully rather than through military action. But perhaps most importantly, studying this alternative timeline changes how we understand our responsibility to preserve and defend democratic institutions. The freedoms you enjoy, the rights you exercise, the peaceful life you probably live, none of it was inevitable. Every freedom you take for granted, every human right you consider fundamental, every peaceful day you wake up exists because the right side barely won when it mattered most. Democracy survived not because it was destined to triumph, but because specific people made specific choices under impossible circumstances. This places enormous responsibility on every generation to preserve what previous generations nearly lost. The institutions that protect human rights, the laws that guarantee individual liberty, the international organizations that prevent genocide, all of them, require active support and constant vigilance to maintain. Understanding how close we came to living in a world where 100 million people were systematically eliminated, where entire cultures were erased, where the concepts of human dignity and individual worth never developed, should fundamentally change how we approach contemporary political choices. When you vote, when you support human rights organizations, when you speak out against authoritarianism, when you defend democratic institutions, St. You're continuing the work that began in those frozen ruins of Stalingrad. You're helping to ensure that the nightmare alternative we've explored remains just that, an alternative that never became reality. Next time, we're going to wrap up our journey by exploring the weight of almost how understanding these near-miss moments in history should change how we think about the present and our responsibility to the future. The final lesson of Stalingrad isn't just about what almost happened, but about what we must do to ensure it never happens. Until then, think about how the ghost of this alternative timeline continues to shape the world you live in today. The institutions that protect you, the freedoms you enjoy, the peace you experience, all of it carries the shadow of what we barely avoided 80 years ago. Hey there, welcome back for our final chapter together. We've taken quite a journey, haven't we? From those frozen bunkers in Stalingrad where individual decisions determined the fate of human civilization, through the terrifying alternative timeline where Nazi Germany achieved total victory, to the modern world where the ghost of what almost happened continues to shape our reality. Today, I want to explore something that I think will fundamentally change how you see your place in history and your responsibility to the future. We're going to talk about the weight of almost how understanding these near-miss moments in history should transform how we think about the present and what we owe to previous generations who held the line when everything seemed lost. The most sobering realization from our journey through this alternative history is just how incredibly fortunate our actual timeline is. Democracy didn't triumph over fascism because it was stronger, more righteous, or historically inevitable. Democracy survived because of 1,000 tiny factors that could have gone either way, any one of which might have produced a completely different world. Let me take you back to that crucial moment we started with. January 31st, 1943, when General Friedrich Paulus finally surrendered what remained of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. When Paulus made that decision, ATI, when he chose surrender over continued resistance, he literally changed the trajectory of human civilization. But here's what should give you chills. He came within 72 hours of making the opposite decision. If Manstein's relief force had broken through Soviet lines just 3 days earlier, if the January weather had been slightly warmer, if Hitler had authorized the breakout attempt when first requested instead of delaying for 18 hours, Paulus might never have been forced to surrender. 72 hours. The margin between our world and the nightmare alternative we explored was measured in days, sometimes hours. Think about that as you go about your daily life. Everything you consider normal about your existence, your freedom to think what you want, say what you believe, live where you choose, all of it traces back to decisions made during a 3-day window in January 1943. The ripple effects of Paulus's surrender stretch forward to today in ways that are still being discovered. The European Union exists because leaders who lived through World War II remembered how quickly the continent could fall under totalitarian control. The establishment of Israel happened because the world finally understood what systematic genocide looked like when scaled to continental proportions. The Cold War, for all its dangers, represented a world where democracy had survived its greatest test and learned to defend itself. Even the United Nations, with all its flaws and limitations, exists because humanity barely avoided a scenario where international cooperation would have been impossible. If Nazi Germany had controlled territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific, if the concepts of human rights and individual dignity had been systematically eliminated across 1/6 of the Earth's surface, there would have been no foundation for building international institutions based on shared values. Understanding this alternative timeline fundamentally changes how we should view current events. When we see authoritarian movements gaining strength around the world, when we witness attacks on democratic institutions, when we observe the gradual erosion of press freedom or judicial independence, we're not watching abstract political developments. We're watching echoes of the same forces that almost triumphed in 1943. The only difference is that we now know how quickly things can change. Democratic institutions that seem permanent and stable can collapse with shocking speed when key pressure points are compromised. The lesson from Stalingrad isn't that democracy always wins. It's that democracy survives only through constant vigilance and active defense. This places enormous responsibility on every generation. The world we've inherited isn't the natural state of human affairs. It's not the inevitable result of historical progress or human enlightenment. It's an extraordinary gift from people who held the line when everything seemed hopeless, who made impossible choices, under unimaginable pressure, who chose to keep fighting when survival seemed impossible. Every Soviet soldier who died defending Stalingrad, every civilian who endured the siege, every commander who made the desperate decision to hold positions against overwhelming odds, they weren't just fighting for military objectives or national territory. They were standing between 100 million innocent people and systematic extermination. They were defending concepts of human dignity and individual worth that we now take for granted. And they almost lost. If the temperature had been 10 degrees warmer, if German supply lines had been more efficient, if Hitler had made different strategic decisions, if any one of dozens of crucial factors had shifted slightly, those soldiers would have died for nothing. The alternative timeline we explored would have become reality. But they didn't lose. Somehow, impossibly, against overwhelming odds and in conditions that challenged the limits of human endurance, They held their positions just long enough for the tide to turn. Democracy survived not because it was destined to triumph, but because specific people refused to give up when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. This should fundamentally change how we understand our relationship to the freedoms we enjoy today. These aren't natural rights that exist automatically. They're not guaranteed by historical progress or protected by invisible forces. They exist because previous generations were willing to pay enormous costs to preserve them, and they continue to exist only as long as each new generation is willing to do the same. When you vote in elections, you're exercising a right that might not exist if German forces had reached the Volga riverbank in 1943. When you express unpopular opinions without fear of government persecution, you're enjoying a freedom that would have been eliminated across most of the world if Nazi racial ideology had been implemented on a continental scale. When you worship according to your own beliefs, when you choose your own career, when you travel freely across international borders, when you access information from around the world, we are TZ. All of these activities depend on the fact that the alternative timeline we explored never became reality. But understanding this history also reveals how fragile these freedoms really are. If they could have been eliminated so quickly and completely in 1943, they can be threatened again. The forces that almost triumphed at Stalingrad, authoritarianism, racial hatred, the appeal of simple solutions to complex problems, didn't disappear when Nazi Germany was defeated. They continue to exist in every generation, waiting for moments of crisis or uncertainty to re-emerge. This is why studying alternative history isn't just academic exercise. Understanding how close we came to living in a fundamentally different world helps us recognize similar threats when they appear in new forms. The specific ideologies may change, the particular technologies may evolve, but the underlying dynamics that could destroy democratic civilization remain remarkably consistent across time. The responsibility this places on each of us is both enormous and deeply personal. We're not just passive recipients of freedoms won by previous generations, we're active custodians of institutions and values that require constant defense and renewal. Every choice we make about political engagement, every decision about civic participation, every stance we take on issues of human rights and democratic governance contributes to determining whether these freedoms survive for future generations. And here's what makes this responsibility so urgent. We now know how quickly everything can change. The Soviet Union seemed like a permanent fixture of the global landscape, but it collapsed within a few years. The Berlin Wall appeared to be a permanent division of power society serve for Europe, but it fell in a single night. Institutions that seem unshakable can disappear with shocking speed when the conditions that sustain them are undermined. The same rapid change that could have handed Nazi Germany control of the world in 1943 could threaten democratic institutions today if we're not vigilant. The technologies are different, the specific threats have evolved, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. Free societies can be destroyed much faster than they can be built. This is why understanding the alternative timeline we've explored should change how you approach contemporary political choices. When you see politicians attacking press freedom, when you witness efforts to suppress voting rights, when you observe attempts to undermine judicial independence, you're not watching normal political competition. You're watching potential first steps toward the kind of systematic destruction of democratic institutions that characterized Nazi Germany's rise to power. The early stages of democratic collapse don't look like tanks rolling through capital cities or mass arrests of political opponents. They look like gradual erosion of norms, incremental restrictions on rights, and the slow normalization of previously unacceptable behavior. By the time the threat becomes obvious to everyone, it's often too late to stop it through democratic means. This is the most important lesson from our exploration of what almost happened at Stalingrad. The margin between civilization and barbarism is much thinner than most people realize. The institutions that protect human dignity, the laws that guarantee individual liberty, the international organizations that prevent genocide, all of them are human creations that require human effort to maintain. They don't maintain themselves. They don't exist because they're natural or inevitable. They exist because each generation chooses to preserve them, defend them, and pass them on to the next generation. When any generation fails in that responsibility, the institutions can disappear with shocking speed. But there's also enormous hope in this understanding. If the survival of democratic civilization depended on the choices made by exhausted soldiers in frozen ruins 80 years ago, then our choices today matter just as much. Every vote you cast, every civic organization you support, every time you speak out against injustice, every effort you make to stay informed and engaged, all of it contributes to ensuring that the nightmare alternative we explored remains just that, an alternative that never becomes reality. The story of what almost happened at Stalingrad is ultimately a story about the power of individual choice under impossible circumstances. When everything seemed hopeless, when survival seemed impossible, when giving up would have been completely understandable, specific people chose to keep fighting. Their choices, made under conditions we can barely imagine, determined the world we live in today. Your choices, made under much more comfortable circumstances, will help determine the world that future generations inherit. The responsibility is enormous, but so is the opportunity. You have the chance to continue the work that began in those frozen ruins, to help ensure that the values and institutions preserved at such enormous cost continue to protect human dignity and individual liberty. As we conclude our journey through this alternative history, I want you to carry this understanding with you. The world you live in today is not inevitable, natural, or guaranteed. It's an extraordinary achievement that required enormous sacrifice to create and requires constant effort to maintain. Every peaceful day you experience, every freedom you exercise, every right you take for granted exists because people who came before you refused to give up when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. They held the line when everything seemed lost, and their perseverance created the possibility for the life you're living today. Now, it's your turn to hold the line, not in frozen ruins under artillery fire, but in voting booths and civic organizations, in conversations with friends and family, in the daily choices you make about political engagement and moral responsibility. The specific challenges are different, but the fundamental task remains the same: preserving what previous generations nearly lost and passing it on to future generations who will face their own tests. The alternative timeline we explored serves as both warning and inspiration. Warning about how quickly everything can change when democratic institutions are undermined. Inspiration about the difference that individual courage and perseverance can make when the stakes are highest. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most consequential near misses. I hope understanding how close we came to living in a fundamentally different world changes how you think about the present and your responsibility to the future. The weight of almost is enormous, but so is the power of choosing to act when action matters most. The world we barely avoided in 1943 reminds us that democracy, human rights, and individual liberty aren't guaranteed. But the world we actually inherited proves that these values can survive even the greatest threats when ordinary people make extraordinary choices to defend them. The choice about what kind of world future generations inherit is now in your hands. Use it wisely.